All right, we are live back at it with a rare Wednesday stream. And I'll be honest with you guys, this won't be a very long stream because I got some stuff to do, but canceled the stream last week because I was busy. And I'll be honest with you, just didn't quite have a lot left in the tank yesterday afternoon. So I decided, why try doing a bad stream when I could just do no stream? So that sort of was what it was, but back on the horse for a few minutes today because we actually got a little bit of news. So give me 1 second. Let me get my stuff in order, and we'll talk a few pieces of NOFX news, and then for the first time ever, I will listen to their new song that dropped this morning. Cool. Sorry, guys, just my chat is in a weird place, and I can't seem to get it out of that place. That's fun. All right, let's get right to it. Time is of the essence here. Not that, but there we go. I didn't necessarily think that today was going to be a day where we got a new song. Screeching Weasel's got the review on the song. He's saying it's not too great. I'm gonna check it out here in a minute, but I wanted to talk some of the NoFX news that actually came down the pike. So they seem to coordinate things with Spin and got an interview in Spin magazine with Fat Mike. And there was some juicy little details to take out of this. There's been some fun interviews lately, whether it's been Skiba's interview with Variety or we have Fat Mike with Spin. Either way, we learned a few things. So, not only did we learn about the new song, I think we finally have a little bit of clarity on the end of NoFX. Most of you who are watching this video watched it because you once watched a video of me breaking down the end of NoFX. And since then, we haven't got a whole lot of clarity on what the actual plans were. Even then, it was a little vague. And I had people coming in the comments saying, hey, they're not going anywhere. Mike is just trolling, which is always a possibility, but I've always got the feeling because of 3 reputable music rags reporting it that this was actually going to be a thing. And it is. NoFX is breaking up. Now, some of the context we'll get here from the interview, and some of it I want to read verbatim. I'm not going to read the whole thing, obviously, because you can go to Spin Magazine and check that out. But as I scroll down here a second, before we talk about the new song, 2023 is not going to be the last year of NoFX. 2024 is. So the plan seems to remain the same. It's just stretching out a little further. They are going to go on a tour, apparently, according to Fat Mike. They're going to hit up 40 cities, and they are going to play every album. Now, obviously, not every album on every show. That would be a very long show. But they are going to play full albums. And that sounds awesome. Like, can you imagine going to the tour stop where they're playing Punk and Drublick? Going to the tour stop where they're playing So Long and Thanks for the Shoes. Like, that would be awesome to hit up one of those shows. So they're really they're going to blow it out right. They are going to give a farewell. It doesn't look like they're just going to stop making music, which is awesome. I do want to pull out this quote here though from Mike. It'll be our absolute final tour. I just don't enjoy it like I used to, but we're all excited about playing our final shows. We're going to play every album we've ever recorded. Every city is going to be very special. We'll have been a band for 40 years with all original members, and we're going to play 40 cities. So 40 for 40, if you will. Every show, we're going to play 40 different songs. It's just a whole bunch of cool things with these last shows. Again, that sounds amazing. What's great about NoFX is their catalog is huge. Because not only do they have this prolific 40-year career with a bunch of full-length album releases, they also have tons of B-sides and C-sides that are relevant songs. Like, that's the one thing with NOFX. You know the B-sides and C-sides. And of course, they've cropped up on other albums. They've done a good job of releasing those to the public. So they have plenty of music. And NOFX fans know a lot of that music. Those are going to be fun shows. So I think it's significant that we finally have a little bit of clarity. Yes, they are breaking up, but here's what it's going to look like. Now, there's been a lot of talk about, shows and pricing and all that. I don't know how that's going to play out. Don't really care about that right now. All I know is if I have the opportunity, I am going to get myself to one of those shows. And obviously they noted that, it is, Nate. It is bittersweet. Obviously they noted that LA is going to be the last show. I would love to make it out there. Don't know if I quite have the teeth to do that. Here was a funny line, though. That was just funny because this is what I've been wondering about. I said it initially. They can break up and still be a band. But the interview pressed Mike on this. The interview asked, and you're also not planning some crazy Misfits style reunion down the line, which is probably for the best based on how the Misfits sounded at Riot Fest. A little bit of a shot there. Oh, that won't happen. But the Misfits have always sucked live. They were just as bad the first time around. So some classic Mike for sure. He also noted, and I don't know if this is going to be the case, but being that every set is going to be unique on that tour, that means there is going to be essentially a live album recorded every night, which is pretty awesome. That is kind of the news element of it on that note, on the end of NOFX, which is still a thing, but it's happening in grand fashion. And I think now, after today, we can put the whole trolling, not trolling thing to bed. Coming to an end. It's over. And Mike had said recently in that podcast he did, and forgive me for not being able to give it credit, that he knew it was, he's not feeling it quite anymore, which is fine. Again, you've been at it for 40 years. Punk rock is tough. That's a success story. They are a musical success story, no matter how you want to cut it. Let's talk about the new song, though, that came out today. Now, again, I have not heard the song, so when I hear it in a second, that'll be the first time that I'm hearing it. But this ties into another thread we've had on this channel. We've been talking a lot of Blink, a lot of Skiba, obviously, partial to Alkaline Trio, but also a fairly big fan of Blink here. And their new song, apparently, was intended to be a Blink-182 song. Now, let me break this down right after I swig this water. So this song, Punk Rock Cliche, was actually written about 6 years ago, according to Fat Mike. And it's a song he shared with Matt Skiba. It's been no secret, Skiba and Fat Mike, good friends. I believe Skiba stood best man / woman at Fat Mike's wedding. So these are pretty close guys. Even though their musical stylings are pretty different, they've always been pretty tight. Now, this was a song given to Matt when Blink was recording the California album. So we're going all the way back to the start of the Skiba era. That's where this song originates from, according to Mike. Now, it's not completely his version. It was a bit of a collaboration, and Skiba put his own spin on it. And it was a song that, according to Mike, Blink was into. Until, this is a key sticking point, until it was known that it was actually Fat Mike that wrote the song. And then, according to Matt, they didn't want to have nothing to do with it. They didn't want to have, I don't know if it was the association with Fat Mike. I don't know what it was. But it's pretty shady. And Mike also notes in this article, in this interview, that he was just going to ghostwrite the song. It's not like he was going to take credit for the song. But apparently, once they got word that it came from Fat Mike, they wanted nothing to do with it, which is odd. It's odd for a couple of reasons. Now, Mike likes to talk his shit about pop punk bands. He always has. But you got to take it with a bit of a grain of salt. He's very friendly with a lot of those bands, even if he feuds with them on occasion. He did mention recently, though, that in the formation of the Punk Rock Museum, that Green Day wanted nothing to do with that. And that's also very significant because they are not dissimilar bands from dissimilar scenes. they've always had an association with each other, and Mike, at least in his younger days, can claim to very much know those guys personally. Same thing with Blink. Blink comes out of that same area. I know they're from San Diego. It's a little bit different than LA, obviously, but they're part of the '90s California punk scene for sure. And I've seen a lot of interviews with Tom DeLonge over the years, specifically the one he did with Tuna on Toast. Nothing but praise for Fat Mike. Nothing but praise. Mike, a while back, had talked about his collaborations and his songwritings with Travis Barker and how much they really seemed to click when they were in the studio. And again, people that have known each other forever. Mike knows Barker all the way back to the Aquabats days. And that's important here because he also noted around this time is when he basically was ghosted by Travis. Now, he notes that him and Travis were never great friends, but they did speak, and then the speaking started. Now, I caught an interview with Mike fairly recently. It might have actually been the Tuna on Toast one. I should give him a producer credit because Stryker is contributing heavily to this video and this stream. But what I want to take away from that is he just noted very quickly and moved on from it that he doesn't talk to Travis anymore. So I think that is the genesis of this. If Fat Mike is being completely truthful, which for as trolly as Mike is, he's rarely dishonest. Let's read though some of the contents of the interview and where he said that. They recorded the album. They recorded the song for the album, and their label said, "This is your first single." Matt called me and said, "Dude, you won't believe this, but your song, Punk Rock Cliche, gonna be our first single." It was a big deal because it was their first single in years. Then he called me up 6 weeks later and said, "I don't know how to tell you this, but I told the band you wrote the song, and they dropped it off the album completely." I was really bummed because I thought it was going to be my first radio hit. I didn't really understand at the time, but I thought about it and I figured, well, they just kicked Tom out of the band. So if anyone got word that I wrote it, to be clear, I didn't care. I was going to ghostwrite it. But I could see how someone saying, "Oh, you had to get Fat Mike to write a song for you," that would be something that they didn't want to come out. But it was just weird. Travis and I used to talk and text pretty regularly. He played on one of my albums. We weren't close, but we were friends. And he just never spoke to me again after that. At first, it felt really bad for me. It really bummed me out because I got my hopes up. And I really liked the song. So about a year or two later, NOFX recorded it because it was still my song. It didn't make single album, but it was recorded 4 or 5 years ago. Now it's coming out on our new album. It's funny because 6 months ago, I reached out to Blink and said, "Hey, you guys want to do a split 7-inch? It'd be pretty cool to have both versions of the same songs." No response from anyone. No shit, but their version is way better than the NOFX version. I tried really hard, but Travis just killed it. He's such a monster on drums. Skiba was singing it. Seriously. I wanted to kick their ass on it, but I think their version is better for me to say. That would have been cool. That would have been cool to have a NOFX Blink-182. From a business perspective, I could kind of understand why maybe they wouldn't want to do a split, although I think the bigger risk in that from the side of both bands would be for NOFX. Blink would assume no risk, and if anything, it would help them to still be associated with a slightly more underground version of punk rock. Obviously, NOFX isn't that underground, but more so than such a mainstream band like Blink-182. The risk might have been for NOFX of possibly alienating some fans by being associated with such poppy pop punk. But I think most people who actually know there's not a huge big difference between the two, other than one's really famous and one is moderately famous, the way NOFX. That's a lot of me talking. Let me take a few swigs of water and then we'll check out the song. Let's see if Screeching Weasel was right. Was the song meh or not? Right. Punk rock cliche. Ironically, that beginning line right there and that singing cadence, that sounds like early Blink. That sounds like Tom could be singing on that. In fact, the way that Mike's vocal intonation there is very reminiscent of like Buddha era Blink.
Sins of the flesh are not sinned alone. Invite the arsonist for incendiary fun. Where there's smoke, there are cigarettes and blindfolds and guns. The house was on fire as the victim screamed while her hands were tied as he barely breathed. We had it all, that's what they'll say. We did not seize, we stole the.
Yeah, I completely believe Mike here. That sounds like a Blink song. That sounds much less like a NoFX song. It doesn't have teeth. Specifically like from a bassy perspective, not just the bass guitar, but it doesn't quite have that kind of low end. But it also doesn't. In that way, it's probably not exactly like a Blink song either, because it doesn't have that that bass tone either that Mark Hoppus would provide on a Blink song.
Now there we are, punk rock cliches. We knew the risks. We played the game with our own rules. We fanned the flames.
Some of the electronics in there kind of sounds a lot like some of the stuff on First Stitch Effort that I don't think completely landed, although it's not awful.
Punk rock cliches. Her life success, full as a lie can be. Those who need to blur the truth believe lies set you free. Enter the arsonist when the fire began. Trust can burn like the Hindenburg and one gasoline man. We had it all, gave it away. The Peru Vincent price we have to pay when we lick clean the silver tray. Why did our home burn down so fast? Castles of stone are supposed to last. Why can't I get past through the past? We knew the odds. We place the best. If you play the dumb con, there's no regret in punk rock roulette. 'Cause when I watched it all crumble away, I realized the walls we built were just paper mache. How punk rock cliche.
So I'm gonna say that I think Mike wrote a really good song there. I don't think the performance and the production is so great on this song. It just not clicking with me. What you could hear lyrically and the basic melody, I think it's pretty good stuff. That's one I would like to just see reworked for my personal taste. Doesn't quite hit with me. Yeah, Nate. That sounds more like a Blink song. Like that sounds like it. That sounds written for Blink. And again, if they were working it with Blink, if Skiba and Travis there, you can see that would seem to fit Blink a lot more, than what they did there. And again, also Nate, as you're saying, I think the contrast would be great to just kind of check that out, to see how it would have played out, and that is a shame. So if this is one of the, I don't think this is going to become one of the big from the album. Now, I'll admit, I have not listened to Barbie Crashing Your Party since I had it on this. For no specific reason, I got no issues with the song. I think I liked it a fair amount whenever I had it on the stream a couple weeks ago, but didn't quite move me. So I am wondering, I am a little concerned. Is this a situation where, given that it's a double album and they did have a lot of material initially, was this the stuff that they didn't make the cutting room? I really don't think NoFX has had a bad release in a really long time, so I'll give them the benefit of the doubt. And either way, this is their last album, so will they put their best foot forward? I don't know. Not too impressed by that. Again, I think the skeleton is there. I think they have a fairly decent skeleton, but it's got to turn into something else. Where am I on time? What do you guys think of short streams like this? I might do this fairly regularly when I'm running a little short in time, and I want to comment on something, or I want to give my take or listen to a new song with you guys. I think I might do this fairly regularly because it doesn't take a whole lot of prep and setup, and then these will be easy to make into digestible little videos and shorts. So I definitely think I want to keep on doing this. I want to check some out though. Well, while we're here and I have a few more minutes, did yeah. Yeah, Mikey boy. Low effort. That definitely could be the case there. Just low effort. Sure. That was the vibe I got. I mean, we all know that NoFX only gives about 60 or so percent anyway, so seems to be. Let me see something. Did anyone here check out or have any interest in the comings and goings of the When We Were Young Fest? Really unfortunate that I couldn't hop on the stream to discuss the calamity that it was. That was a bummer. I really would have liked to have talked about that on the stream, but I couldn't get. I did secure myself a ticket though for next year's, so I'm gonna put it out there. Put it out there a year in advance. If anyone wants to kind of cop a hang, because I couldn't even afford a ticket for my significant other, so I will just be there myself. If anyone is into the popular side of punk, next year we will hang in Vegas. We'll have a good time. Looking forward to that. Wind permitting. On that note, though, I want to check out some stuff from this year's show to see if there's anything worthwhile watching. I have been like completely blacked out on the internet. I've been so busy at work that I haven't got a chance to check out some stuff. So I wanted to see if there was any live footage that made it, and anything, maybe some AFI that we can pull out of there, because I have been completely in the dark on this thing. Definitely could be the case, Nate. That's why I'm not dismissing it as a whole, because I think there's actually a well written song there. Oh, here we go. Here we go. Found just what I was looking for as I was trying to kill some time here. Losing the interest and attention of everyone on the stream. I did believe. Okay. There's Girls Not Gray. Total. I thought I saw some Total Mortal on here. There we go. Let's see how Total Mortal sounded. Could be the recording. Does not sound great. And AFI is a pretty tight live band, so I'm going to chalk this up to the cell phone it's being shot on. I was hoping we'd get some vibe of the crowd, though. So that was obviously on Sunday because they got winded out on Saturday. What about, were any of you guys there? Did anybody get screwed by that whole situation? I don't even necessarily blame the promoters because I mean what could they do? I mean, I guess they could have made the call earlier, but then they might have been in a whole different situation. I don't want the Adele song. I don't want the Adele song. Let's see. There was some AFI, Motionless in White. Again, old bands I generally care for, but let's see how Story of the Year sounded from a different angle. Yeah, what does this crowd look like? Are they like old like us, or are they trendy young people that are going to check some stuff out? I have no idea if my audience cares at all about Story of the Year, but a classic song.
For a second I wish the tide would swallow every inch of this game as we ask for air tonight. Screaming a song, writing a race into words. Swear I won't disappear, 'cause I never have before.
That looked like a much funner time than what was going on that AFI set. I just didn't like the vibe. This does have a thing that's a little bit reminiscent of Warped Tour, though. Like these deeply songs on a crystal clear, bright, sunny day where it feels like you should be like in a dark room, razor blade, alcohol, dead. Here's where you're at. Okay. One last thing I wanted to do on here, and then I do have to get out of here. But I did get permission because I reached out to the guy I wanted to watch somebody else's YouTube video. Not MMA. Why did I type that in? I want to watch someone else's YouTube video. If you haven't checked this guy out, his channel is amazing. Like, if you like my channel, you need to check out this guy's channel, The Punk Historian. He does monthly, like 30-minute deep dives into a single topic. He did one last month on the dead Kennedys, which was pretty awesome. The one that really resonated with me, and the one that I picked up and I was like, I got to check out more of this guy's channel, was the one he did on No Use for a Name. We'll watch that in the future on this channel. But I did reach out to him on Instagram. He was nice enough about it. Hey, can I react to one of your videos on stream? And he gave me the permission. Go ahead and go with it, because we're a day or two late, but it's still fall. It's still the holiday season. And my man wanted to break down the Misfits. There's a few good Misfits documentaries, if you will, made by YouTubers on YouTube. But this dude always has some really good stuff. So first of all, as you can see there, I am subscribed to him. Please go ahead and subscribe to him. Subscribe to him and watch his videos. Like I said, if you get any value out of my content, you will 100% value his content. And I believe he's on tour right now, or he's pretty close to. So check out his band as well. But let's check out the evil endeavors of the original.
In most musical genres and cultures, it's pretty standard for those who pioneer it to not only leave forever lasting marks on the sound, but also to become some of the most fundamental and essential artists in the eyes of most fans. And even for those who may not be particularly fond of them personally, they still can't deny the sheer significance these artists have to the scene, sound, and ideals of their genre. In addition, we'll often see the ideas of these artists pass down the lineage of their scene, and sometimes even in ways that blatantly repurpose them in an almost tributary manner. But whether these artists are being impersonated by their diehard fans or simply influencing other artists who did or will further develop a genre, they exist in a league of their own as not only the founding artist to a specific scene and sound, but also as some of the most well-respected figures in that scene for as long as their legacy lasts. How's it going, folks? My name is Jack Miller. I am the incredibly underqualified punk historian, and since that
Jack Miller, that's what I meant to say his name was, not just Jack Miller. All his stuff.
Creepy time of year is now officially underway, I figured it was time to dedicate an entire episode to the legendary New Jersey ghouls themselves, the Misfits. As always, I'll be taking you all through the twists and turns of the band's history, from their beginnings in the early stages of the American punk scene, all the way up to their current standing in music today, as well as discussing their incomparable legacy, and of course some of my personal thoughts towards them. Before we move on though, I do want to give a couple of disclaimers. First of all, this video is strictly going to be about the original Misfits run from the late 70s and early 80s, and while I...
What, no Michael Graves love? Come on. Or the current, not the current Danzig associated version, but the one where... where my man is, where Only is doing the vocals, which he's not bad. Only's not terrible at vocals.
I do plan on diving into the various offshoots they've had over the years. For the sake of time and staying on track, I will only be talking about the original run in this video. And secondly, I want to give a shout out to the YouTuber Jeff Frumis. He has a ton of killer deep dive videos all about the nooks and crannies of Misfits history. So if you're looking to get even more info on the Misfits after you watch this video...
Check that guy's channel out. I have not come across that. We're all 138. I have a crappy Misfits tattoo, right? I'll have one. Part of being in the game, right? You can't really see it, but your crappy Misfits tattoo, you gotta have them.
I'll leave a link to his channel in the description below. Also, I want to let you all know that I made a Spotify playlist of some of my favorite Misfits songs, along with a few tunes from former and current band members' side projects over the years, so if you're interested, you can find a link to that in the description below. And finally, if you are interested in seeing videos about punk rock, may I humbly ask that you please subscribe to my channel here.
Subscribe
I'm
to this
having
stuff.
a lot of fun making these, and I want to make sure that all of you can keep having fun watching them. Anyways, as I'm sure many of you guys know, the story of the Misfits begins in the year 1977 in the town of Lodi, New Jersey, a small town roughly 9 miles outside of New York City. The band was started by lead vocalist Glenn Anzalone, and having already sung, played in, and roadied for bands all through his high school years, by the time he started the Misfits at 22, he was already a veteran when it came to the local live music scene. And throughout his years in different bands, Glenn had also begun to develop a vocal style of his own, heavily influenced by singers like Elvis Presley, Jim Morrison, Roy Orbison, and Bill Medley. And despite this strong influence from 50s
Has anyone ever actually checked out the Danzig Does Elvis album? Like, is that any good? Is that worth watching?
and 60s rock, as we all know, this vocal style would leave a permanent mark on punk rock forever, and still gets impersonated by bands to this day. The first musician Glenn would recruit for his new band was a drummer named Manny Martinez, and although he'd lived most of his life up until this point in New Jersey, Manny's uncle owned a bar up in New York City that jazz drummer Buddy Rich frequently performed at, and through this connection, Manny had been fortunate enough to take lessons from Buddy personally. The pair would begin jamming in Glenn's basement, and this incredibly primitive version of the band consisted of Glenn singing and playing keyboards, backed only by Manny's drumming. The two-piece would not last very long, however, as Manny's neighbor happened to be dating a guy named Jerry Caiafa, who also happened to be a bass player, and it wouldn't be long after that until the three of them started playing together. The trio would get their band name from Marilyn Monroe's final movie from 1961, The Misfits, and developed a very Talking Heads, Devo, new wave kind of sound, especially with Glenn playing keys. And once they had put together a decent enough set, the group would start doing some small-time gigging around the New York and New Jersey area. They would also record 2 songs and self-release a 7-inch titled Cough Cool through an independent label called Blank Records that Glenn founded for the sole purpose of putting out the release. And
Not
as far
Blank
as
TV.
trivia goes, the band did play 2 shows at the legendary CBGB's in New York City back in the early days, but contrary to somewhat popular belief, they would mostly play elsewhere in the city, namely because of some bad blood between the band and CBGB's owner Hilly Crystal after several things went wrong at their shows. The guys would still
I've always kind of wondered about that. They're an early New York punk band, but they're a little later in the 70s, obviously. And it's funny how much of punk history they're just kind of there for. They're just kind of always around the Ramones, even though they're a little less associated with that scene. And then, obviously, only there on the night that Sid OD'd. Only was there that night.
attend shows at the venue from time to time, though, and with 1977 being the year punk really started to take off in the underground New York scene, the Misfits guys fully immerse themselves in it, quickly becoming huge fans of UK punk classics like The Adverts, The Damned, and Generation X. The band would also draw a great deal of inspiration from New York's hometown heroes, the Ramones, and after witnessing a show of theirs at CBGB's, the guys became enthused about having an image of their own, kind of like the Ramones did.
Now, there's some people that I've heard this take before, and I don't necessarily agree with it, that the Misfits are just a Halloween ripoff of the... I don't buy that. I don't think that's the case. But I've heard that argument, and I get it. Like, especially musically, like they're using the same 3 chords, but they have their own thing, as I think he's about to talk about that.
This burst of inspiration, the band would do some renovations, if you will, towards the end of 1977, starting with the addition of guitarist Frank Licata. And it was also around this time that we saw Glenn step away from playing keyboards to focus more on his singing. But despite the band getting closer and closer to what they would soon become, good things unfortunately often come with a price, and in the fall of 1977, Manny Martinez would lose interest in the band and would eventually end up leaving. The remaining members would then find a replacement drummer in Jim Catania, and it was this lineup of Glenn, Jerry, Frank, and Jim that would give the world its first real taste of the Misfits. This was also around the time the band members all started using stage names, and Jim Catania became Mr. Jim, Frank Licata took the name Franche Coma, and as I'm sure we all probably know, Jerry Caiafa and Glenn Anzalone would forever brand themselves as Jerry Only and Glenn Danzig. And once the new band had dialed things in and put together a set, they would burst into 1978 with their new punk rock sound, and it wouldn't be long after that until they would take another whack at recording. Like I mentioned earlier, Glenn had founded the label Blank Records to put out the band's now pre-existing Cough Cool 7-inch. However, in 1978, he was contacted by Mercury Records, a subsidiary of Universal Records, who had been hoping to use the same name for their sublabel. In exchange for the name, Mercury offered the Misfits 30 hours of studio time at CI Studios in New York City. After accepting the deal, the band would then record 17 tracks at the studio with the help of producer Dave Achilles. After recording sessions were complete, the band compiled 14 of the 17 tracks they'd recorded onto an LP they planned to release later that year. But after several unsuccessful attempts to find a suitable label willing to release it, they wound up going the DIY route again and founded a new label called Plan 9 Records. And instead of releasing the full LP, the band opted for a 4-song 7-inch that they gave the name Bullet, and that made its debut in June of 1978. The EP featured a
Classic, by the way. Classic.
picture of JFK getting shot in the back of the head on its cover, and included the now iconic Misfits tracks Hollywood Babylon, We Are 138, Attitude, and of course the title track Bullet. The lost LP would, however, eventually get released under its original title Static Age, but this wouldn't happen until much later in February of 1996.
And I believe, like, the only recording of it, right, is what made it onto Static Age before it, like, integrated.
Having had a good amount of time to get to know each other through rehearsing, playing shows, and recording, the guys in the Misfits found that they all had a shared interest in horror movies and comics, and it wouldn't be long after that until horror started having a major influence on their music and stage presence. One of the most noteworthy of these influences were the famous Monsters magazines from the 60s and 70s that featured pictures of all kinds of creepy characters drawn in elaborate detail, and this artwork would have a huge impact on the Misfits' album art, flyers, and merch. In fact, the band would even borrow the magazine's title font to stylize their band name. The Misfits would also start using a character a lot of us have probably come to know as the Fiend as their mascot. However, this character was actually named the Crimson Ghost and originally appeared in a 1940s horror movie by the same name. The movie was later remade into a TV film called Cyclotrode X in the 60s, and since the guys have all reflected on watching horror movies and shows during that decade, I'm willing to bet this particular version of the film is where they originally saw the character. But anyways, it wouldn't be long until the Misfits begun incorporating the horror themes into their music as well, and the songs on their next 2 EPs would feature horror-themed lyrics that would quickly become another staple. Before either of these releases took place, however, guitarist Franche Coma and drummer Mr. Jim would part ways with the band in 1979, and the roles would be passed on to Bobby Kaufhold and Joey Poole, respectively, who would take on the stage names Bobby Steele and Joey Image. As a
Rest in peace, Joey Image, right? Didn't he pass away about a year or two ago?
a result of the member changes on top of the recording process, the releases wouldn't come out until later on in the year, and the first one to arrive dropped in August of 1979 under the name Horror Business. This 7-inch was also the first release to feature the Crimson Ghost or Fiend character on the artwork, and included the tracks Teenagers from Mars and Children in Heat, along with the title track. The band would
Good thing he did, Nate. Good thing he did.
then follow up with Night of the Living Dead roughly 2 months later, which was actually the debut of the world-famous cut Where Eagles Dare. As famous as that song is now, though, it was originally released as a B-side to the EP's title track, along with a cover of the 60s rock song Ratfink by Alan Sherman. With all these great releases coming out, it wasn't long until the Misfits really started to pop off in the early US punk scene. And it was also around this time that the band founded their official fan club, or Fiend Club as we know it. The Fiend Club would eventually grow into a worldwide community of extremely diehard Misfits fans, but in those days it operated in the small circles of the American punk circuit, where fans would communicate directly with the band through fan mail. People would enter the club by filling out and mailing the inserts found inside the band's records to a pre-provided address listed on the form, and then Glenn and Jerry would personally send out tons of free stickers and pins.
Remember joining street teams and fan clubs back in the day? Just like that? Through mail? I miss punk through mail. Really do. I'm not being sarcastic either. I miss ordering albums, sticking literal cash into envelopes and sending them off. For good times.
to club members, along with order forms for t-shirts, records, and other merchandise in the mail. This was when Jerry and Glenn were getting really into silkscreening, and along with printing shirts for the band, they also started printing all kinds of horror-themed t-shirts that they sell at various shops around New York City. And this is actually how the Misfits made a lot of their money in the early days, and probably how they funded a lot of their recording.
I'd be curious to know the ratio of I've heard the argument before that the Ramones are a t-shirt company that had some music because their primary driver of income during their heyday was their t-shirts. I'd be curious to know how that tracks with the Misfits. Obviously, the Misfits have had a much more like disconnected career, but they're also like iconic for their iconography, so to speak. Like that is a big part of it. Like there's that criticism that the Misfits are more of a t-shirt than a band, which I think that's horseshit. Like the Misfits have great music. Wasn't always performed the best, but that's how it was intended. The Misfits are great songwriters, though, within the auspices of punk. And I do think, yeah, some people might just wear a Misfits shirt because it looks cool. Good for them. But they are much more than a t-shirt. Or the zines. Yes, absolutely. Dead beats the zines. Always good info there of how to act.
Recordings too. Jeff Frumis actually has a really cool video all about the Fiend Club and the early Misfits merch, so if you want to learn more about that, you should definitely go check out his video. I'll leave a link to it in the description below. Like I was hinting at earlier, the new horror theme also inspired the Misfits to adopt a new image for their band, and they started regularly performing in all black clothing and often wearing shirts or wristbands with skulls printed on them. Sometimes they were the homemade shirts with the Fiend logo, and other times they were just random skeleton-themed t-shirts the guys found at the store. As far as their look goes, though, there is nothing more iconic to the Misfits than the devil lock hairstyle that Jerry Only is still rocking to this day. And that style would soon become a staple look in the punk scene, especially in the horror punk and psychobilly realms that the Misfits had a huge...
I mean, who amongst us, they actually had hair, did not get ready for school occasionally? Try to make the whole thing come down. We all did that. Admit it.
Impact on. With all the buzz they were getting in the scene, the band were able to score themselves a gig opening up for the Damned when they came through New York City in the summer of 1979. At some point during or after the
Yeah, you're right, Nate. They're pretty connected.
show, Jerry Only had spoken to Damned frontman Dave Vanian about the two of them doing a UK tour in the fall. And while both parties seemed enthused about it at the time, being a younger, less experienced band, the Misfits were a lot more eager to pursue risky endeavors to get their name out. And Vanian didn't quite consider this until they unexpectedly showed up in the UK for a tour that the Damned hadn't actually planned on having them on. Vanian did try and get the Misfits onto the tour, but things would fall apart pretty quickly with how rushed everything probably was. And on top of that, the Misfits weren't actually getting paid for any of the shows, and as a result, they wound up dropping out after a couple of dates. After the whole fiasco, Joey Image ended up quitting the band and flying back home to the US earlier than planned, but the other guys instead decided to hang out in London for a while until the originally booked flights left in December. The band got up to quite a few shenanigans while they were across the pond in the UK, and most notably when Glenn Danzig and Bobby Steele spent a couple nights at the Brixton jail after getting into fights at a jam show. And their time in jail
and not all of the members got released, right? Is that the same story? Or no, it's in New Orleans, right? Where they didn't have enough bail money for the drummer. Wrong, Misfits.
The UK would inspire the song London Dungeon the band would later release on an EP in 1981. Once they returned to the States, the Misfits were again in need of a new drummer. However, instead of rushing out to search for musicians right away, the band decided to take a brief hiatus to chill out after their escapades overseas. As a result, they decided to release a compilation EP of sorts that combined all the tracks from the Bullet and Horror Business releases, along with one additional song from the Static Age recording sessions in 78 by the name of Last Caress that's now possibly the most iconic Misfits song of all time. The EP was given the name Beware and made its debut in January of 1980. The band had originally planned to release it several months prior and sell it while they were on tour overseas. However, they unfortunately weren't able to complete the cover.
So it was Doyle that they didn't let out? Man.
artwork in time, and the release was delayed due to their trip to the UK. After the release of Beware, the Misfits would eventually return to rehearsing sometime around April of 1980, this time with a drummer from Queens, New York named Arthur McGuckin, who would take on the stage name Arthur Googie. Although he chose to stay in the city to be closer to his construction job, he would still regularly commute to Lodi for rehearsals, and Jerry only has stated that his level of dedication to the band played a major role in their success during the early days. It was also around this time that Jerry's younger brother Paul Caiafa had become inspired by his older brother's musical endeavors and started learning guitar and frequently attending the Misfits shows and rehearsals. With the help of his older brother and Glenn Danzig, Paul managed to get the hang of playing guitar pretty quickly, and it wouldn't be long until he actually started jamming along with the band at their rehearsals. Ironically enough, this was also around the time that things would start to go sour with guitarist Bobby Steele, and Jerry only has made various remarks over the years about finding him hard to get along with. Towards the end, Bobby would also start showing up to practice.
Is that the stuff that started getting released in '97? Deadbeats? Is that what you're talking about?
Is late and was even late to the studio several times when the band had started recording again in August of 1980. Getting fed up with the situation, Jerry only opted for the band to replace him with his younger brother, and following an incident where Bobby showed up late to a studio session and failed to finish recording the guitar parts after 2 hours of takes, Jerry, Glenn, and Arthur finally decided to boot him out of the band. They would then promptly take on Paul Caiafa as their new guitarist, and somewhere during all of this he would also don the stage name Doyle von Frankenstein. The only track the band had been able to get guitars recorded for with Bobby was the previously mentioned London Dungeon, but once Doyle was officially on board, he would finish up the recording for the other 2 tracks, Horror Hotel and Ghouls Night Out, that the Misfits had written for their new EP. The EP would then make its debut in April of 1981 under the name Three Hits from Hell, and the band would follow it up with numerous shows throughout the United States, including a few in California, one of which was actually played with the notoriously dangerous LA punk band Circle One. The band also played a number of shows with other noteworthy acts like the Necros and Black Flag, and the guys have shared numerous stories about these shows throughout the years, such as the time Black Flag opened for the Misfits and Necros in Lodi on Christmas, or the time Henry Rollins sang We Are 138 with them in San Francisco. They would also release 2
I need to hear Rollins doing that. That's something I need in my life.
more songs in 1981 titled Halloween and Halloween 2 on a second 7-inch release that appropriately came out on October 31st of that year, and both of these tracks were also recorded with Doyle during the sessions in the summer of 1980. As for Bobby Steele, however, while all of this was going on, he founded the horror punk band The Undead, and he's actually still playing with them to this day. So at this point, the Misfits had a really solid catalog of EPs and a lot of touring experience under their belt, and not to mention they also had a die-hard fan base backing them. So I don't think I'd be the only one to say that their debut full-length record was almost a little overdue at this point. But just like they always had, the band had been ferociously at work rehearsing, so it wouldn't be long until Glenn Danzig started showing up to practices with a whole bunch of brand new songs. With all the hype from their Halloween and Three Hits from Hell 7 inches, along with the ever-growing Fiend Club, the Misfits were able to score themselves a deal with Ruby Records in late 1981, a subsidiary of the larger label Slash Records. The guys had also been recording sporadically during their downtime from shows throughout 1981, and had worked up a collection of 12 new tracks they planned to release on a full length the following year. Though they'd originally intended to drop the album through Plan 9, they unfortunately were just not able to sufficiently finance it on their own, but the record deal with Ruby came at the utmost perfect time, and the Misfits' debut full length was officially unleashed on the world in March of 1982 under the name Walk Among Us. Along with the 12 studio tracks, the album also included a live recording of a song called Mommy Can I Go Out and Kill Tonight, and it, along with the better half of the new album, quickly
Mommy, can I go out and kill tonight?
became staples in their live sets. The record is also chocked full of horror and sci-fi movie references in its music and cover art, and some of its most noteworthy Easter eggs include the flying saucers from the 1956 sci-fi flick Earth vs. the Flying Saucers, and the Rat-Bat Spider from 1959's Angry Red Planet, both appearing on the album artwork, and the fan-favorite track Astro Zombies actually takes its name from a 1968 movie of the same name. In fact, the album's title itself is even a reference of its own, and it was inspired by the 1956 horror movie The Creature Walks Among Us. But above everything else, else, from a purely musical standpoint, Walk Among Us upped the Misfits game to a whole new level. Like I said before, they already had a lot of really strong material in their back catalog, and even if nobody really knew it at the time, looking back, it's not hard to see that they were destined for bigger and better things than a lot of their peers. And I think this album is something that really gave us our first glimpse of that. All of a sudden, everything.
Where are you guys at on this? I'm more of a fan of the Walk Among Us. Not sure what that name. But yeah, you know what I'm talking about. I think they went a little more metal, if I'm completely honest, right after that.
Everything felt so much tighter and more put together. The songwriting felt a lot more defined, and it seemed like they really had a clear vision with the horror stuff as well. Plus, by now, Glenn Danzig had really found his singing voice, and his signature tone was already starting to leave its mark on music this early on in his career. Not to mention, the Caiafa brothers had their guitar and bass tones a lot more dialed in by this point, and this record does a great job of showcasing not just that, but also how fast Doyle was able to fall in sync with the rest of the band. And once Walk Among Us dropped, it was no secret that he was a much better fit as a guitarist than anyone else they'd had in the past. And then on top of all that, Arthur Googie was just a spectacular drummer, and the performance he delivered behind the kit on this record, I would argue, is some of his best drumming on record. And as I'm sure a lot of you guys who have been in bands before can attest to, having a good drummer changes everything. Looking at the big picture though, a record done by such an A-team of musicians like that is destined to spark attention in a music scene one way or another, and especially when you also factor in what a brilliant songwriter Glenn Danzig was back in the day. And while these songs are all certainly simplistic in nature, when you have such a strong...
That's the key. That's the key. They write really, really good songs. Really, really good songs. They write, this might sound blasphemous or sacrilege, they write pop songs, essentially. Now, they perform it in a punk manner, but they're very simple pop songs that are very good.
Group of musicians playing together, it doesn't matter how simple or complicated the music is. Any song is going to stand out a lot more if it's performed by better players. And I think the fact that the Misfits had become such great musicians through their previous endeavors is a big part of the reason Walk Among Us stood the test of time the way it has. After the release of Walk Among Us, the Misfits would embark on a full US tour.
Yeah, Nate, I think the band we were just talking about, NOFX, is a perfect example about the drummer bringing out the strength.
Tour kicking off in Washington, D.C. and ending in Los Angeles. But even though the tour would prove to be a success for the band's career, tensions would come to an all-time high between Glenn Danzig and Arthur Googie.
Tensions with the Misfits? No.
The stress of touring had incited a lot of arguments between him and Glenn Danzig especially, and oddly enough, one of the most heated conflicts between them was actually over a trip to McDonald's when Arthur wanted another burger, but Glenn insisted he couldn't have one due to their tight budget. And as I'm sure a lot of us know, people tend to say some nasty shit when they're really hungry. I've heard that the final straw in his disagreements with the rest of the band, however, was regarding the Walk Among Us album art though, as Glenn had Doyle and Jerry's brother edit his photo on the album art, cutting out his spiky blonde hair and wristwatch. I don't know where exactly this falls in the timeline, but I do know that he completed the entire tour with the band after the album's release, so if I had to guess, I'd assume he probably found out that Glenn had his photos edited sometime after the album had already come out. With Googie now out of the picture, the Misfits needed a drummer yet again, and they would initially approach their friend Eerie Vaughn, who'd shot photos for them in the past, but at that point he was fully committed to his band Rosemary's Babies, and he wasn't able to take the gig. The band would instead find their new drummer through their friends in Black Flag, and Henry Rollins would put them in touch with his band's former drummer Julio Valverde Valencia, or otherwise known by his stage name Robo. Having played in Black Flag between 1980 and 1981, Robo had likely already hung out with the Misfits guys a lot and heard the bulk of their material, so he probably didn't need that much convincing to relocate to New Jersey and jam with his old friends. And just for the sake of trivia, Robo's...
Just to complete the loop, it feels like, I don't know, Bill Stevenson should have drummed for the Misfits, doesn't it?
departure from Black Flag was actually forced upon him and the band because of visa issues coming back into the United States after their UK tour, since he was actually an immigrant to the US from Colombia. He joined the Misfits pretty soon after returning to the States from his home country, though, and once the band had gotten him up to speed through rigorous rehearsing, they shot back out on the road for another full US tour with the Necros in September and October of 1983. But before they went back out on tour and fans were still waiting for their return, the Misfits would compile a live EP of 7 tracks taken from 2 separate shows in 1981 and released it under the name Evil Live. The live EP made its debut in late December of 1982, and a special edition version was
And is way too much money at the local record store, by the way, right now. I'm sure it's good stuff, but God, it costs so much damn money.
also available for a brief time exclusively through the Fiend Club. Anyways, the first tour with Robo would prove to be another success for the band, but it did come very close to going horribly wrong when they were arrested in New Orleans and charged with grave robbing after they attempted
There we go. Let's see if he closes the loop on that story we started earlier.
to find the grave of a famous voodoo practitioner named Marie Laveau. Luckily, Jerry and Doyle's brother had come along with them as a roadie, though, and he was able to get away before the cops showed up and bailed them out of jail later that night. The band would continue on with their busy touring schedule
Oh, he didn't take the bait. He didn't take the bait.
into 1983, and they would also start sporadically recording new tracks again during their breaks from the road. These recording sessions would come and go from October of 1982 all the way until July of 1983. Likely due to excessive infighting between him and the other guys, Glenn Danzig was growing increasingly uninterested in the band and had already been working on getting a new project off the ground. However, he and the rest of the Misfits all agreed to do one final full-length release, and along with what they'd compiled from their previous recording sessions, they recorded 2 additional tracks by the names of Blood Feast and Death Comes Ripping to fill out the album into a full-length. The band would also embark on one final full US tour, along with a series of one-off shows and smaller US legs during the album's finalization process, but would eventually decide to call it quits after Robo left the band in August of 1983, canceling a few of their last shows. I'm not precisely sure why Robo left the band when he did, but I've heard it's because he and Glenn Danzig weren't seeing eye to eye, and this probably had a
Shocker.
lot to do with Glenn's apathy towards the band in their later days. The Misfits would play their final show in Detroit, Michigan with their friends in the Necros on October 29th, 1983, and they would recruit Verbal Abuse drummer Brian Damage to fill in for Robo, but he actually wound up getting too fucked up to play, and the other 3 members of the band more or less threw him off stage, if you know what I mean. Being more
Awesome. Awesome.
than familiar with the Misfits' music, however, Todd Swella from the Necros was able to fill the role for their final show, so at least we can say the band's last performance had some sort of happy ending, bumps and bruises aside. The final album would arrive roughly 2 months later in December of 1983, and its 2 sides were given the names Earth AD and Wolf's Blood. This record saw the Misfits branch off into new territory, showcasing a much faster, rawer sound akin to a lot of the hardcore punk stuff that was really starting to take off in the scene around the time it came out. And to be completely honest, none of the band members have ever really released anything quite like it ever since. Glenn, Jerry, and Doyle would then pursue other endeavors after their original run as the Misfits officially ended, the first of which was Glenn's band Samhain, who released their debut album the following year in 1984. But that and the many other Misfit offshoots are very
People love Samhain, by the way. Like, there are some hardcore Samhain heads out there.
much topics for videos. 1984, 7 months after they officially split up. The EP, of course, included the now famous title track along with another song called We Bite, and a proper studio recording of the Mommy Can I Go Out and Kill Tonight track that appeared on Walk Among Us as a live recording. In typical Misfits fashion, the tracks had been recorded during separate studio sessions, and the title track was actually done in August of 1981 and features Arthur Googie on drums. The other 2 songs were recorded roughly 2 years later during the early sessions for Earth AD and feature Robo instead. The EP's title track takes its name from the British horror film Fanatic from 1965 that was released in the US under the name Die Die My Darling. The album's back cover also includes an art piece done by Brian Schroeder from the hardcore band Septic Death, who some of you guys probably also know as Pusshead. The tunes from this 7-inch would later be included on the cassette and CD versions of the Earth AD
Did all the Metallica artwork, by the way, right? That's the same guy?
was talking about that record, it's because they weren't originally on it. Glenn Danzig would also compile and release a few Misfits compilations over the next few years following the breakup, and the first of these releases was given the name Legacy of Brutality and made its debut in September 1985. This comp included a number of previously unreleased tracks, most of which had been recorded during the Static Age sessions in 1978. The second of these comps came in the form of a self-titled LP that's more widely known as Collection. This one serves as more of a greatest hits type of thing, featuring 20 fan favorite tracks from all their previous releases, and it came out in July of 1986. Glenn had intended to follow this up with a second compilation.
Isn't there all the allegations that they kind of justice for all it and took the bass out of the collections?
By the name of Enter at Your Own Risk later that year, but these plans were eventually scrapped and the track listing would later be reworked into the Collection 2 comp from 1995. The last of these releases would instead be an extended version of the Evil Live EP from 1982 that included 5 additional tracks from the shows the original release was recorded at, and it fittingly made its debut in October of 1987. I do of course also have to mention the legal battle between Glenn and Jerry regarding the sales of these
legendary legal
comps here, and it would begin with Jerry claiming that he and Doyle had written around 25% of the material, but this was later proven to not be true, and that Glenn did in fact compose 100% of the original Misfits catalog on his own. The pair had another dispute after that regarding the artwork and imagery, and oddly enough this included the Crimson Ghost skull as well, which really wasn't even theirs to begin with. But the two parties would eventually make a compromise allowing Jerry and Doyle to continue on with the Misfits band name, and that they would share merchandising rights with Glenn. This would actually be settled outside of the court, and given that Glenn and the Caiafa brothers have been performing as the Misfits again since 2016, I'm willing to bet they probably walked away from the discussion without any bad blood. The next chapter in the Misfits story wouldn't come until their reunion in the mid-90s, but that's a subject I won't be diving into in this
But please do. Please do. We need a full-scale video on the Graves era.
video.
Not on current Graves, though. We don't need that.
One, because like I said in the beginning, I want to keep things focused on the original Misfits, and two, Michael Graves, who fronted the band from 1995 to 2000, is very publicly associated with the Proud Boys, and I don't want to endorse him or his music on my channel. So instead, I think it's more important to turn our attention to the overwhelmingly massive legacy the original Misfits have garnered over the years, and the mark they left on music forever. So for a lot of us, the first thing that comes to mind in terms of the Misfits legacy is probably the horror punk genre and its close cousins death rock and psychobilly, as they were basically born out of the Misfits ideas in some way or another. The horror punk stuff is of course the most obvious example here, as most of the genre's biggest bands pretty closely resemble the Misfits in sound just as much as they do when it comes to lyrical content and image. While that's certainly not to say these bands don't have their own musical identities, comparing them to the Misfits is a lot like comparing a band like Screeching Weasel or Chicks Dig It to the Ramones, in that they definitely have their own sound and external influences, but it's not hard to see where they get their foundation from.
Good analogy there.
And I don't think any of the musicians in these bands would try and tell you they don't sound like the Misfits. I won't talk about this stuff too much here since I want to do an entire video on it at some point. But just in case there's any newcomers watching that are trying to get into horror punk, a few bands I would recommend include Blitzkid, The Crimson Ghost, Mr. Monster, The Other, The Nerve Agents, and the solo artist Wednesday 13, as well as his band The Murder Dolls with Joey Jordison from Slipknot. I'd also highly recommend AFI's horror punk stuff from the late 90s, especially the Black Sails at Sunset album and the All Hallows EP. And I'd also say,
and Art of Drowning, you left out the best one. Go check out my video on my Ultimate AFI playlist from this era.
a lot of TSOL's early stuff isn't essential to this genre as well, although I wouldn't code them strictly as a horror punk band. But at the very least, the Dance With Me album from 1981 is definitely a must-listen for anyone trying to get into horror punk. Like I said, horror punk's sister genres, death rock and psychobilly, are also prime examples of Misfits' influence, and while this stuff is maybe a couple more steps removed from the Misfits in terms of sound, it's still not hard to see the impact they had on it, and I for one think we have Glenn and Jerry to thank for those genres as well.
He may get into it, but I'm going to say too the even bigger legacy is the covers that other bands did.
And then once you factor in the image and personalities those genres have, the Misfits' influence becomes all that more apparent, and just like horror punk, you'd be hard-pressed to find any musicians in psychobilly or death rock bands that aren't die-hard Misfits fans. Much like horror punk, I'd like to do proper rundown videos on these genres as well, but again, if anyone's watching who's just getting into this stuff, a few recommendations I can give you would be the Cramps, the Horror Pops, Tiger Army, the Meteors, and the Coffin Cats in the case of psychobilly, and the Reverend Horton Heat is also an important band to add to the psychobilly essentials list, but they definitely lean a lot more on the rockabilly side of things.
We need to talk about Tiger Army more.
In the case of the more goth, post-punk inspired death rock sound, I'd say the most important bands to check out would be Christian Death and 45 Grave, but a few others include Sex Gang Children, Super Heroines, Flower Leopards, and Scarlet's Remains. A lot of TSOL stuff crosses over into this realm too, and once again, I'd say that Dance With Me album is an essential for this genre as well. I will admit though, I'm not as well versed in death rock as I am in horror punk and psychobilly, so I'm honestly looking forward to diving into its history a little more when I eventually do an entire video on that sound as well. But inspiring a bunch of other horror fanatics to pick up guitars and write creepy songs of their own is absolutely not where the Misfits' legacy ends. And to be completely honest, I would argue that they might be one of the most influential bands in rock music as a whole. So outside of horror punk, psychobilly, and death rock, the Misfits are obviously a huge influence on punk rock overall. And truthfully, their legacy goes all the way to the top here, with bands like Green Day, The Offspring, and NOFX citing them as a huge influence on their music. And it definitely doesn't stop with them. You'd be pretty hard-pressed to find a punk fan that's never at least given the original Misfits stuff a solid try. And if we're really being honest here, they're 110% an essential to punk rock. And even with as overplayed as some of their songs might be to some of us, I'd say it's still pretty rare that you'll find an honest-to-God Misfits hater in the punk scene.
Oh, there's a few. There's definitely a few. But also, again, the covers outside of punk rock, the metal covers, and the influence they had on metal as a whole, I think. I wonder if he's going to... Reverend Horton Heat. That does sound like an awesome show.
And on top of that, as I'm sure a lot of you guys also probably know, they were a huge influence on heavy metal too. A lot of their songs have been covered by big names like Metallica, Slayer, and White Zombie, and I have to say, I for one think you can hear a little bit of Danzig in most of the early thrash metal stuff if you listen for it. And just like with punk, it's not just the tip of the iceberg they left a mark on here, it's the entire genre as a whole, and you'll still see tons of heshers with patch-covered battle vests repping Misfits patches and shirts. Kinda like Motorhead is famously the metal band all the punk rockers love, I don't think I'd be the only one to say that the Misfits are the punk band all the metalheads love. The Misfits are also a fundamental influence to a lot of the darker emo stuff from the early and mid 2000s, and I think it's pretty safe to say that the Used and My Chemical Romance would not have been the same bands without the original Misfits stuff.
Great point.
And truthfully, the Misfits influence goes just as deep with emo as it does with punk and metal, and if you go see any of these bands from this era, I think you're pretty much guaranteed to see at least one person wearing a Misfits shirt at the show. And their legacy doesn't even stop there. Artists from all over the loud rock world have been and still are drawing inspiration from the Misfits everywhere. I'd say the most obvious examples of Misfits influence outside of punk, metal, and emo would probably be Marilyn Manson and Guns N' Roses, but like I keep echoing with all these genres, when the influence is that prominent at the top, it goes all the way down to its underground. And even though they tend to be a little overlooked in this regard, I think the Misfits are kind of a mega band like the Beatles or Nirvana that just completely reinvented music with what they did. Then there's the whole image and business side of things that people don't usually talk about as much, but the truth is the Misfits are just as influential on music culture as they are on the actual music itself.
Aesthetics. They're such an important band for aesthetics.
Like I touched on earlier when I talked about the Fiend Club, they were definitely pioneers within the DIY merch and marketing world, and while I don't know if I'd say they were the first band to do this, they were without question one of the most influential. And then of course there's the whole image thing, and while I know gimmicks and themes aren't everybody's thing, the truth is they really can leave a lasting mark when they're done right. And I think it's safe to say the Misfits played a huge role in popularizing extreme and provocative art and aesthetics in rock music as a whole. Again, I definitely wouldn't say they're the only band to popularize this sort of thing, but especially in the case of the darker side of this concept, it's no secret they're an absolute essential. And to use metal as an example once more, we absolutely would not have all that gore-obsessed death metal stuff if it wasn't for the Misfits getting the ball rolling in that direction when they did. If I'm really being honest though, I don't even think all this is the entirety of the mark the Misfits left on music. These are just some of the most obvious examples that stick out in my mind. So if you have any other ideas,
I think, and I'm going to have to go here in a second, I think they inspired a lot of people, myself included at times, to be like, and I can't play a lot of songs, but I play Last Caress.
About this, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. And finally, as I always do, I will leave you with some of my personal thoughts on the Misfits and their legacy. Like a lot of you guys probably have, I've been a Misfits fan since I was a teenager. The first song I heard from them was Halloween, and since then I've definitely been enough of a fan to own a couple of the records and rock the t-shirt from time to time. I don't think I can claim that I'm as much of a diehard Misfits nut as some of the more dedicated people are, but especially since they're a band I listened to a lot during my teen years, they definitely will always have a place in my music collection. They honestly might have had an even bigger impact on me as a horror fan than as a musician though, since it was really the Misfits and a few other horror punk bands that I was into growing up that got me into watching scary movies in the first place. Lately they've actually started showing up in my rotation a lot more than usual though, and I have to say these days horror punk overall seems to be becoming one of my favorite subgenres. Also, as I'm sure a lot of us do, I've always had some kind of idea of how massively influential the Misfits are on music, but researching for this video really put things in perspective for me. And I gotta say, now especially, I would say the original Misfits are probably in the top 5 most quintessential punk rock bands of all time.
He didn't mention it, but I think when he touched on the emo stuff too, I think the metalcore stuff hugely influenced by them, both aesthetics and musically.
And I think that about sums up our little crash course here on the Misfits. I honestly had a blast revisiting their catalog and researching this video, and I hope you guys enjoyed this as kind of a Halloween special of sorts. But that's enough for me.
That was awesome. That last part on the legacy, that was one of the best summations I've ever seen of the Misfits. And there's other bands I think you could do that with, and I hope he does, or maybe I can make the video. But that was a great summation of the Misfits and their influence and spreading it out across genres, which just does not get talked about enough. The Misfits, I like how he said like they're like the Beatles. And sometimes I heard someone say once that the Beatles are like Earth. You almost take them for granted because they're just there. And I kind of think the Misfits are similar. I think that's a good connection. In your mind, you're not connecting the Misfits and the Beatles. But I think that's a great connection. Guys, I absolutely have to go. I literally have a car running. I got to get on out of here. This was fun, a little quick stream. I'll clip some of this for some shorts and some videos later in the week. See you guys later.